The letter felt thin and brittle in Evelyn Hayes's hands, a fragile ghost from a world she couldn't imagine. It had traveled more than 2,000 miles, passed from the clean, manicured fingers of a New York postman to the calloused, grimy hands of stagecoach drivers, finally arriving in the oppressive parlor of her father's Fifth Avenue home. The paper, a cheap, practical stock, smelled faintly of pine and wood smoke, a scent so alien it might as well have come from the moon. The script was stark and spare, each letter carved into the page with a heavy, deliberate hand. There were no pleasantries, no flowery introductions. It was a document of pure, unadorned need. Asterisk, Miss Hayes. Asterisk, I am in need of a wife. I am told you are in need of a home. I own a ranch in the Wyoming Territory. It is a hard life, but an honest one. I am a widower, 36 years of age. I do not drink to excess, and I am a man of my word. I can offer you shelter, food, and my name. Asterisk, if this is agreeable, the enclosed train ticket will take you as far as Cheyenne. A stagecoach runs north from there to the town of Solitude. I will meet you. Asterisk, sincerely. Asterisk, asterisk, Silas Harrow. Evelyn read it for the 10th time, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. It wasn't a proposal, it was a contract, a transaction of desperation between two strangers separated by a continent. And yet, it was also a key, a rusty, uncertain key to a lock she was desperate to escape. The alternative was Mr. Abernathy. The thought of him made a sour taste rise in her throat. He was her father's business associate, a man twice her age with a moist, fleshy handshake and eyes that lingered on her collarbones. He smelled of stale cigars and pomade, and when he smiled, his lips pulled back to reveal teeth stained yellow from tobacco. Her father saw him as an opportunity, a merger of fortune and family. He saw Evelyn not as a daughter, but as capital, an asset to be leveraged. He will provide for you, Evelyn, her father had said just last night, his voice devoid of warmth. This is not a matter for girlish fantasy. It is a practical arrangement. Practicality was a cage, and Evelyn felt its bars closing in. She looked at Silas Harrow's letter again. Asterisk. A hard life, but an honest one. Honesty. The word was a cool drink of water in a desert of polite deceptions and veiled threats. In New York, honesty was a liability. Perhaps in Wyoming, it was a virtue. She didn't hesitate. She packed a single trunk with her most durable dresses, her mother's silver locket, and a few cherished books. She left a note on her perfectly made bed, a brief, cold farewell that mirrored the lack of love she had always felt in that house. With Silas Harrow's train ticket clutched in her gloved hand, she slipped out into the pre-dawn gray, a ghost leaving a mausoleum. The journey was a brutal education. The train, a marvel of modern engineering, was her last link to civilization. It rattled and swayed, carrying her through the rolling green hills of the east, which slowly flattened into the vast, unending plains. The world outside her window grew larger, emptier, and more intimidating with every mile. The manicured landscapes of New York gave way to an ocean of grass that stretched to a horizon so wide it seemed to bend the sky. In Cheyenne, she traded the relative comfort of the train for the bone-jarring reality of the stagecoach. It was a cramped, foul-smelling box on wheels, shared with a silent fur trapper, a whiskey-soaked prospector, and a nervous young woman with a baby. For more than a week, they jolted over rutted tracks that were less roads and more suggestions of a path. Dust coated everything, her clothes, her skin, the back of her throat. The sun was relentless, the nights bitingly cold. This was the West she had only read about, and the books had lied. They had spoken of adventure and romance, but they had failed to mention the exhaustion, the grit, and the profound, soul-crushing loneliness of the land. Finally, the stagecoach crested a barren hill and rattled down into the town of Solitude. The name was painfully apartment. It was little more than a single muddy street lined with a dozen weathered, false-fronted buildings. A saloon, a general store, a blacksmith, and a handful of indistinguishable structures. The wind, a constant, mournful presence, whistled through the gaps in the boards and kicked up dust devils that danced down the empty street. As Evelyn stepped down, her legs unsteady, she felt the eyes of the town upon her. A woman sweeping the porch of the general store paused, her broom still. Men loitering outside the saloon turned their heads in unison. Their stares were not welcoming. They were sharp, assessing, and tinged with something she couldn't name. Pity, perhaps, or a morbid curiosity. She went into the general store, the only place that seemed remotely respectable, to inquire about Mr. Harrow, the proprietor. A balding man with a stained apron polished a glass as she spoke. "Harrow," he said, his eyes flicking over her fine, if travel-worn, dress. He didn't look at her directly. "Aye, he's expecting someone. You'd be the mail-order bride, then—" The words hung in the air, clinical and humiliating. Evelyn merely nodded, her face burning. The man grunted. "He'll be along. Doesn't come to town unless he has to." He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "You'd be wise to be careful up on that mountain. Miss, it's no place for a lady." Before she could ask what he meant, two women who had been examining a bolt of calico nearby drifted closer. "Another one of them murmured, just loud enough for Evelyn to hear. "Poor thing, doesn't know what she's getting into." "Hush, Martha," the other chided, though she made no effort to lower her own voice. "It's a shame, is what it is, after what happened to the first one." A cold dread, sharper than the Wyoming wind, settled in Evelyn's stomach. "The first one?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. The women exchanged a look. "His wife," Martha said, her eyes wide with grim satisfaction. "Disappeared one winter, 5 years back, just vanished. He said a blizzard took her, but folks have their own ideas. A man like that, living all alone up in that dark place. It ain't natural. He hasn't spoken more than 10 words to anyone since." The bell above the door chimed, and a sudden silence fell over the store. The air grew thick and heavy. A man stood in the doorway, his frame so large it blocked out the afternoon light. It was Silas Harrow. He was taller than she had imagined, a man built of long lines and hard angles, wrapped in a heavy sheepskin coat that had seen years of hard use. His face was all sharp planes and shadow, weathered by sun and wind to the color of worn leather. A faded white scar cut through his left eyebrow and disappeared into his hairline, giving him a permanently severe expression. His dark hair was shaggy, and his jaw was covered in a rough stubble. But it was his eyes that held her captive. They were the color of a winter sky before a storm, a deep, impenetrable gray that seemed to hold a universe of sorrow and silence. He looked at her, his gaze direct and unreadable, and for a moment, Evelyn forgot how to breathe. He didn't speak. He simply gave a curt nod to the store owner. Then his eyes settled back on Evelyn. He walked toward her, his boots making a heavy, rhythmic sound on the wooden floor. He stopped a few feet away and looked at her trunk. "This all?" he asked. His voice was a low rumble, rough like gravel, as if it was unused to forming words. Evelyn could only nod. He picked up the heavy trunk with one hand as if it were a satchel of feathers. Without another word, he turned and walked out. Evelyn, caught between the hostile whispers of the townspeople and the intimidating silence of her husband-to-be, hurried to follow him. He led her to a battered buckboard wagon hitched to 2 sturdy horses. He loaded her trunk onto the back and then turned to her, gesturing toward the seat. The journey from the town began in that same profound silence. The wagon wheels groaned as they left solitude behind, climbing a steep, winding track that led away from the open plains and into the looming shadow of the mountains. The landscape grew wilder, more menacing, The rolling hills gave way to jagged peaks and dense forests of pine and aspen. The temperature dropped, and the wind carried the first sharp bite of snow. Silas Harrow did not speak. He kept his eyes on the trail, his hands firm and capable on the reins, navigating the treacherous path with an easy competence that spoke of a lifetime spent in this unforgiving wilderness. Evelyn huddled deeper into her coat, her city clothes providing little defense against the encroaching cold. The silence stretched, becoming a living thing between them. It was not a comfortable quiet, but a heavy, watchful one, filled with unspoken questions and a history she was beginning to fear. As they gained elevation, the snow began to fall in earnest, not the gentle, picturesque flakes of a New York winter, but a hard, driving sleet that blurred the world into a churning vortex of white. The track became slick with ice, and the horses strained, their breath pluming in the frigid air. Evelyn felt a new kind of fear, raw and primal. Here, there were no police, no neighbors, no one to hear a scream. The world had been reduced to this wagon, this silent man, and the howling of the storm. She was utterly, terrifyingly alone. Hours passed. The last vestiges of daylight bled from the sky, leaving a bruised, purple twilight. Evelyn was numb with cold and exhaustion, her body aching from the constant jolting of the wagon, just when she thought she could endure no more. Silas pulled a rough, heavy wool blanket from behind the seat and, without a word, draped it over her shoulders. It was a simple, practical gesture, devoid of tenderness. Yet it was the first hint of care she had received from him. It smelled of horse and leather and the same pine smoke as his letter. Finally, through the swirling snow, she saw it, a single point of light, a faint yellow glimmer in the oppressive darkness. The cabin. It was not the rustic, charming home she might have once foolishly imagined. It was a dark, solid shape, hunched against the snow, a fortress built to withstand the wilderness, not to welcome a visitor. It was utterly isolated, surrounded by a black sea of pine trees, their branches heavy with snow. The silence here was different, deeper. It was the silence of a world devoid of human life. Silas brought the wagon to a halt, set the brake, and jumped down. He moved with a quiet efficiency, unhitching the horses and leading them toward a lean-to barn that was little more than a shadow against the greater shadow of the forest. He returned for her trunk, then looked up at her. "Come," he said. It was an order, not an invitation. Inside, the cabin was a single large room, dominated by a massive stone fireplace where embers glowed weakly. A rough-hewn table and 2 chairs sat in the center. A kitchen area was tucked into one corner, and a narrow door at the back presumably led to a bedroom. The air was cold and still, thick with the smell of old wood, ash, and something else, a faint, lingering scent of solitude itself. It was a man's space, Spartan and functional, scrubbed clean but devoid of any softness, any warmth, any sign that a woman had ever lived there. Silas dropped her trunk by the back door. "Your room is through there," he grunted, gesturing with his head. He moved to the fireplace and began to stoke the embers, adding logs from a nearby stack. He worked with his back to her, a broad and intimidating silhouette against the growing flames. Evelyn retreated into the small bedroom. It contained a narrow bed with a simple quilt, a small wooden chest of drawers, and a single window that looked out into the black, snow-filled night. She sat on the edge of the bed, her entire body trembling. Whether from cold or fear she couldn't tell. The weight of her decision, of the thousands of miles she had traveled, of the whispers in the town, and of the immense, silent man in the other room, crashed down on her. Later, he brought her a bowl of hot, savory stew. They ate at the table in silence, the only sounds the scrape of spoons against pottery and the crackle of the fire. The storm raged outside, the wind shrieking around the corners of the cabin like a hungry animal. When they were finished, he took her bowl and rose, "The privy is out back. Don't wander," he said, his face impassive in the firelight. "The woods aren't safe at night." He pointed to a bucket of water by the stove. "For washing." And with that, he took a blanket, settled into a large chair by the fire, and turned his attention to the flames, effectively dismissing her. He was going to sleep right there, leaving her the bed. It should have been a comfort, but it only amplified her sense of isolation. She lay in the small, cold bed, fully dressed beneath the quilt, her body rigid with tension. Sleep was impossible. Every sound from the old cabin was magnified in the darkness. The groan of the roof timbers under the weight of the snow, the relentless moan of the wind. She heard the soft thud of Silas adding another log to the fire. Then came other sounds. A soft, scratching noise at her window. She told herself it was an ice-laden branch from a pine tree, but her heart hammered in her chest. She strained her ears, listening. There it was again, more insistent this time. Asterisk scrape, scrape. An hour later, a floorboard creaked in the main room, followed by the soft sound of the main cabin door opening and closing. Where had he gone? Into the blizzard. The questions swirled in her mind, each one more terrifying than the last. She crept to the window, peering through a small patch she had cleared of frost. Through the driving snow, she thought she saw it, a shadow, a tall figure moving at the edge of the woods, just beyond the reach of the firelight spilling from the main room window. Was it him? Or was it something else? She scrambled back into bed, pulling the quilt up to her chin. The cabin, her promised sanctuary, felt like a trap. The man who was to be her husband was a stranger with a dark past, a silent keeper of secrets. And outside, in the vast, frozen wilderness, something else seemed to be watching, waiting. In the suffocating darkness of her first night, Evelyn Hayes was consumed by a single, chilling thought. She had not escaped a cage. She had merely traded it for a much larger, colder, and more dangerous one. The days bled into one another, each one a stark lesson in survival. The woman who had once debated which gloves to wear for a carriage ride through Central Park now learned to tell the difference between seasoned oak and green pine by the heft and scent of the wood. Her hands, once soft and pale, became chapped and calloused. Mornings began before sunrise, in a cold so deep it felt like a physical weight. Evelyn's first task was always the fire. She would kneel on the stone hearth, her breath a white cloud in the gloom, and coax the stubborn embers back to life. The small victory of a dancing flame was a triumph against the vast, indifferent cold that pressed in on all sides. Her next trial was water. The stream was a quarter-mile trek through knee-deep snow. Armed with 2 heavy wooden buckets and an axe, she would make her way to the gurgling artery of life that refused to completely surrender to the winter. The ice on its surface was thick, and she would have to chop a hole each morning, her arms aching with the unfamiliar strain. The water was so cold it burned her skin, and the journey back, with the bucket sloshing and weighing her down, was a brutal, muscle-screaming ordeal. Yet, with every trip, she felt a sliver of strength she hadn't known she possessed. She was learning the rhythms of the mountain, the harsh cadence of a life stripped to its barest essentials. Cooking was an exercise in invention, with a limited supply of flour, salt, and dried beans, supplemented by the rabbits or grouse Silas brought back from his traps. She learned to make stews that simmered for hours over the fire and dense. Heavy bread baked in a cast-iron pot. It was plain, hearty food, meant for fuel, not pleasure. But the warmth of it in her belly was a comfort, a small stay against the wilderness. Through all of it, Silas remained a phantom. He was a creature of the forest, and it was to the forest he returned each day. He would rise with her, share a silent meal of coffee and leftover bread, and then, pulling on his heavy coat and taking up his rifle, he would disappear into the swirling snow. He never said where he was going or when he would be back. He simply vanished into the wall of white, leaving her utterly alone in the crushing silence. His absences gnawed at her. They were too long, too frequent for merely checking a few traps. Sometimes he would be gone for the entire day, returning only as the last light failed, his face grim and unreadable, a fresh rabbit dangling from his hand. Other times, he would return empty-handed, his boots caked in snow from miles of walking, a weariness in his eyes that went beyond physical exhaustion. The uncertainty bred a dark suspicion in Evelyn's mind. The whispers from the town echoed in the quiet of the cabin. Asterisk. A man like that, living all alone up in that dark place. It ain't natural. What did he do out there, for hours on end? In the frozen, desolate woods? Was he communing with a memory? Or was he tending to a secret? One afternoon, driven by a restless need to impose some order on her chaotic new world, Evelyn decided to clean the small bedroom. It was a bleak space, containing nothing of her own besides the contents of her trunk. She was scrubbing the rough wooden floor when she turned her attention to the small, rickety chest of drawers. The top two drawers were empty, but the bottom one stuck fast. After a moment of tugging, it gave way with a screech of dry wood. Inside, nestled beneath a pile of yellowed newspaper clippings, was a small, folded square of linen. She picked it up. It was a lady's handkerchief, fine and delicate, a world away from the coarse utility of everything else in the cabin. The edges were trimmed with lace, now frayed and discolored, and in one corner, embroidered with a faded blue thread in an elegant, looping script, was a single name. Lillian *. Lillian? The name was like a whisper from a ghost. This was hers. This was the woman who had lived here before her, the wife who had vanished into a blizzard. Evelyn traced the letters with her finger, a cold dread mixing with a strange, unwelcome pang of jealousy. This was a piece of the mystery, a tangible link to the woman Silas had presumably loved, the woman whose place Evelyn had now taken. She quickly folded it and pushed it back into the drawer, but the name was seared into her mind. That evening, the silence at the dinner table felt heavier than usual. The stew she had made sat untouched in her bowl. The question burned on her tongue, a dangerous, necessary fire. Silas ate methodically, his gaze fixed on his food, a wall of indifference around him. Finally, Evelyn could bear it no longer. "Silas," she began, her voice barely a whisper. He looked up, his gray eyes startlingly direct. "The people in town, they spoke of your wife." The change in him was instantaneous and terrifying. It wasn't a flash of anger or a flicker of sorrow. It was a complete and utter shutdown. The life in his eyes was extinguished, replaced by a flat, stony emptiness. His jaw tightened, a muscle jumping beneath the stubble. He placed his spoon down with slow, deliberate precision, the sound echoing in the stillness. Then, without a word, he pushed his chair back, stood, and walked out of the cabin, closing the door softly behind him. He left her alone with the howling wind and the ghost of a name. He didn't return for over an hour. When he did, he carried a fresh armload of firewood, his face set like granite, as if the conversation had never happened. But it had, and his reaction was more damning than any angry denial. It was the reaction of a man with something to hide. That night, Evelyn's sleep was plagued by nightmares. She dreamt she was lost in the snow-choked forest, the trees like skeletal figures reaching for her. A woman's voice, thin and sorrowful, drifted through the pines, whispering a name over and over. Evelyn. Evelyn. In the dream, she saw a figure in the distance, a woman in a pale dress, her form indistinct against the snow. It was Lillian. She knew, and her ghostly voice was not a welcome, but a warning. A few days later, a sudden, violent gust of wind, a precursor to a larger storm, slammed against the cabin. The window in the bedroom, its latch long rotted, was thrown open with a crash. As the wind tore through the small space, it caught the door of the old, decaying wooden wardrobe standing in the corner. The door flew open, and from a hidden, high shelf, a small collection of items, dislodged by the force, came tumbling to the floor. Evelyn, startled, went to investigate. There on the floorboards lay a small, worn, leather-bound book of poetry, a faded blue hair ribbon, and a single, small woman's boot. Its leather cracked and stiff. They were Lillian's things, hidden away, forgotten. She picked up the boot. It was small, delicate, utterly unsuited for the harsh reality of this mountain. It spoke of a different life, a life that had ended abruptly. Holding it, Evelyn felt a profound sense of trespassing, of living in a place where the past was not dead, but merely sleeping, waiting to be disturbed. The storm that had been threatening for days finally descended that night with a terrible, all-consuming fury. It was no mere snowstorm. It was a blizzard, a white devil that clawed at the cabin, seeking entry. The wind shrieked like a banshee, and the snow fell so thick and fast it was impossible to see more than a foot from the windows. The world ceased to exist beyond their four walls. They were in the middle of their silent dinner when a sound like a rifle shot echoed through the room. A blast of icy wind and snow exploded into the cabin. One of the main room's windows had been blown in, the glass shattering. The wooden frame splintered. Snow and wind poured into their sanctuary, extinguishing half the lanterns and threatening the fire itself. In an instant, Silas was on his feet. "The blanket from your bed, and the hammer!" he roared, his voice a powerful command that cut through the storm's chaos. Evelyn didn't hesitate. She scrambled into the bedroom, grabbed the thick quilt, and retrieved the hammer from a toolbox. Together, they fought the storm. He used the hammer to nail loose boards from the barn over the gaping hole, his body shielding her from the worst of the wind as she held the wood in place. Her fingers were numb, her face stung from the ice-laced wind, but they worked as a team, a silent, desperate pact against the rage of the wilderness. When the hole was sealed, the cabin was plunged into a semi-darkness, the wind still audible but its icy breath held at bay. They were both shivering violently, their clothes damp, the temperature in the cabin having plummeted. The fire in the hearth, though still burning, seemed a fragile defense. "Get close to the fire," Silas ordered, his voice still rough, but lacking its usual edge. He pulled the large chair he slept in and one of the dining chairs as close to the hearth as was safe. He sat in his chair and looked at her, a silent instruction. Hesitantly, Evelyn sat in the other chair. It wasn't enough. The cold was a physical thing, seeping into her bones. Silas watched her for a moment, his expression unreadable in the flickering firelight. He stood, retrieved the heavy wool blanket he used, and draped it not just over her, but over both of them, creating a small tent of shared warmth. He sat back down, so close now she could feel the heat radiating from his body, could smell the scent of pine and cold air clinging to his clothes. They sat like that for a long time, huddled together, two strangers bound by a storm. The wind howled, the fire crackled, but within their shared blanket, a fragile peace descended. The silence was different now. It was not a void, but a space filled with a raw, unspoken tension. He had protected her. He had shared his warmth with her. He was not just a monster, not just a keeper of dark secrets. He was a man, strong and capable, and in this moment of vulnerability, terrifyingly close. The fear she felt was no longer simple. It was tangled now with a confusing, unwelcome flutter of something else, a pull, a wanting. She looked at his profile, his harsh features softened by the firelight, the scar above his eye a pale line in the shadows. He was staring into the flames, his mind 1,000 miles away. Perhaps back in another winter, with another woman. The question rose from a place deep inside her, a whisper of both defiance and desperate need. She had to know. She had to understand the man whose life she had stumbled into. Leaning her head slightly toward him, so that her voice would carry no further than the space beneath the blanket, she whispered into the suffocating silence. Do you fear me or want me? The question hung in the air between them, fragile and momentous. Silas flinched, as if her words had been a physical touch. He turned his head slowly, his storm-gray eyes meeting hers. For the first time, the wall was gone. In his eyes, she saw not coldness, not anger, but a profound and bewildered confusion. He looked at her as if he'd never truly seen her before, and in that gaze, she saw a man lost, caught between the ghost of his past and the woman shivering beside him in the present. He didn't answer. The fire popped, the wind raged on, and the question remained, unanswered, in the breathless dark. The silence that followed her question was a chasm, deep and absolute. The only sounds were the hiss of the fire and the low moan of the wind. Now, a weary ghost of the blizzard it had once been. Silas did not pull away. He simply sat there, a man carved from mountain stone, the firelight catching the sharp angles of his face. The confusion in his eyes slowly gave way to a profound, bone-deep weariness, as if her two-edged question had finally broken through a wall he had spent years building. He let go of the blanket, letting it fall into the space between them, and the cold rushed back in. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, and stared into the heart of the fire as if searching for words in the embers. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low, fractured thing, the sound of ice breaking under a heavy weight. 5 years ago, he began, not looking at her. This cabin wasn't so quiet. Evelyn held her breath, knowing that to speak, to even move, would shatter this fragile moment. This was the answer, not to her question, perhaps, but to every question that had haunted her since she'd arrived. Her name was Lillian, he said, the name a rough stone in his throat. She was not from here. She came from a town back east, prettier than this one, greener. She wasn't made for this life, for the cold, for the silence. He paused, and a muscle worked in his jaw. I thought my love would be enough to keep her warm. I was a fool. He described a woman of laughter and light, a woman who tried to plant flowers in the rocky soil and hum tunes he'd never heard. He spoke of her with a detached reverence, as if describing someone from a storybook, not a wife of flesh and blood. The detachment, Evelyn realized, was a shield. The winters were the hardest on her, the loneliness. It gets inside a person up here. If you let it. She started to change. The laughter stopped. She'd just stare out the window for hours. At the snow. He fell silent for a long moment. And Evelyn could picture it perfectly. The vibrant woman from the east, slowly being bleached of all her color by the unending white of a Wyoming winter. The silence of the mountains mirroring the growing silence in her soul. That winter, 5 years back, it was the worst I'd ever seen. A blizzard came on fast, much like this one, but meaner. I was out checking the trap lines, trying to get back before it hit full force. I told her not to leave the cabin. For any reason, I made her promise. His voice cracked on the last word. A single, sharp sound of failure. When I got back, she was gone. He said the words so plainly, so devoid of emotion, that they were more chilling than any scream. Her coat was gone, a small satchel. But the snow, it was coming down so hard. Her tracks were gone within minutes. I searched for 3 days. I walked until I couldn't feel my own feet. I screamed her name until my throat was raw. But there was nothing, just white. The snow took her. It swallowed her whole. He finally turned his head and looked at Evelyn, and the desolation in his eyes was so complete it stole her breath. They never found her body. When the thaw came, a search party from the town came up. They found nothing, no sign. It was like she just vanished off the face of the earth. Here, his voice hardened, the grief icing over into a bitter resentment. But people need a story they can understand. A woman doesn't just disappear, so they made one up. They decided the blizzard wasn't the monster. I was... The whispers from the general store now had a voice. His voice. They said I was too quiet, too hard, that I drove her to it, or that I did it myself. that I buried her somewhere out in these woods where no one would ever find her. They had no proof. Nothing, just suspicion. But suspicion is a kind of poison. It gets in the water. After a while, a man gets tired of seeing it in everyone's eyes. So I stopped going to town. I stopped talking. The silence they accused me of, I embraced it. It was better than their voices. He sank back into his chair. The story told, he looked drained, an empty vessel hollowed out by memory and injustice. The chasm between them had been filled, not with an answer, but with a tragedy. Evelyn felt a war raging inside her. A part of her, the cautious city woman, felt a prickle of fear. He was right. A woman doesn't just disappear. The story was neat. Too neat, perhaps. But as she looked at the broken man before her, another feeling, stronger and more powerful, rose to the surface, a deep, aching wave of compassion. She didn't see a monster. She saw a man sentenced to a solitary prison, not by a judge, but by grief and gossip. A man so wounded he had walled himself off from the world. She didn't know what to say. Words felt small and useless in the face of such a loss. So instead, she did the only thing she could think of. She reached across the small space between them and gently, hesitantly, laid her hand on his forearm. His muscles were rigid as stone beneath her touch, but he didn't pull away. They sat there for another hour, two silent figures by a dying fire, a fragile truce declared in the heart of the storm. In the days that followed, the blizzard receded, leaving behind a world transformed, buried under a thick blanket of pristine, silent white. The air inside the cabin had changed, too. The confession had not brought them intimacy, but it had cleared the air of the heaviest suspicions. The silence between them was still present, but it was a different quality now, less a wall of hostility, and more a shared space of quiet understanding. The storm had left its scars on the cabin. The temporary patch over the window was not enough, and a section of the roof had been damaged, allowing a slow, steady drip to form in one corner. Repairing it became their first shared project. Working together was a clumsy, unspoken dance. He was a man of few words, giving directions with a nod of his head or a gesture of his hand. "Hand me the saw. Hold this steady." Evelyn, in turn, learned to anticipate his needs, handing him tools before he asked, holding the rough-hewn planks in place as he hammered them, her arms aching from the strain. There were moments of accidental closeness that left her breathless. While fixing the roof, he stood on a ladder, leaning down to take a nail from her. For a moment, his face was inches from hers, and she could see the flecks of silver in his gray eyes, the deep lines etched around them by sun and sorrow. Another time, while moving a heavy table, their hands brushed, and a jolt, hot and electric, shot up her arm. They both pulled back as if burned, a flush rising on Evelyn's cheeks. One afternoon, the path to the stream now a treacherous landscape of hidden ice beneath the new snow. Evelyn went for water alone. She was feeling a new confidence, a pride in her own resilience. But her worn and city boots were no match for the mountain. As she stepped on what looked like solid ground, her foot shot out from under her. She cried out as she fell, her head striking a snow-covered rock. The world exploded in a brief, sharp flash of pain, and then darkness. She awoke to the feeling of being lifted. Strong arms were around her, one securely under her knees, the other supporting her back. She was being carried. Her head throbbed, but she managed to flutter her eyes open. She was looking up at Silas's stubbled jaw, at the grim, focused line of his mouth. He was carrying her back to the cabin as easily as he had carried her trunk. "You're all right," he grunted, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through his chest and into her ear. "Just a knock on the head. Stay still." She obeyed, letting her head rest against the rough wool of his coat. She could feel the steady, powerful rhythm of his heart beating against her back. He smelled of pine and cold, clean air. For the first time since arriving, She felt completely safe. This silent, formidable man, who the world saw as a monster, had become her protector. The journey back to the cabin was a blur of motion and a strange, dizzying sense of intimacy. He laid her gently on her bed, his movements surprisingly careful, and tended to the cut on her head with a clean rag and some foul-smelling herbal salve. He said nothing, but his touch was firm and reassuring. That night, as if to mark the shift between them, he brought out a dusty clay jug from the back of a cupboard. "Mead," he said, pouring a small amount of the golden liquid into 2 tin cups. "My father used to make it, from honey and mountain herbs." Evelyn accepted the cup. The drink was surprisingly sweet, with a fiery warmth that spread through her chest and limbs, chasing away the last of the day's chill and the lingering ache in her head. It loosened something inside her, unwinding the tight knot of fear and propriety that had governed her for so long. They drank in their usual silence, but it was a comfortable silence now, softened by the warm glow of the fire and the potent honey wine. He told her a little about the herbs in the mead, pointing out which ones could be used for medicine. She, in turn, told him about a book she had read, describing the sprawling libraries of New York. They were small, tentative bridges of words, built across the chasm of their different worlds. He poured them another cup. The fire had burned low, casting long, dancing shadows across the room. The cabin felt like the only place in the world, a warm, glowing ember in the heart of the frozen darkness. Evelyn felt a strange, languid haze settle over her. She looked at Silas, truly looked at him, and saw not the G-Vet CO, not the widower, not the town pariah, but the man who had shared his story, tended her wound, and sat with her in the dark. A powerful, undeniable pull. Something she had been fighting for weeks, finally broke its leash. He must have seen it in her eyes. The air grew thick, charged with unspoken energy. He stopped speaking mid-sentence, his gaze locked on her mouth. He leaned forward, slowly, as if pulled by an invisible string, giving her every chance to turn away. She didn't. She couldn't. His lips met hers. It was not a gentle, exploratory kiss. It was a collision, a raw and desperate claiming. It was the taste of mead and wood smoke and 5 years of desolate loneliness. His mouth was firm and searching, and his kiss was deep, slow, and utterly overwhelming. All the pent-up tension, the fear, the suspicion, the burgeoning desire of the past weeks ignited in a single, uncontrollable blaze. She kissed him back with a ferocity that surprised them both, her hands coming up to grip his rough shirt, pulling him closer. It was a kiss of shared solitude, a desperate affirmation of life in a place that felt so close to death. It was everything, and then it was over. He broke away with a ragged gasp, as if coming up for air after a lifetime underwater. He pushed himself back, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. His face in the dim light was a mask of shock and self-loathing. His chest heaved, and his gray eyes, moments before filled with a raw wanting, were now wild with something that looked like panic. "I shouldn't have," he rasped, his voice raw. He stood abruptly, knocking his chair over. He wouldn't look at her. He stared at the cabin door as if it were his only escape. "Silas?" she started, her voice trembling. "No!" He cut her off, his voice sharp with a pain she couldn't understand. He finally looked at her, his eyes filled with a terrible, bleak finality. "I'm not allowed to touch you." And with that, he turned, wrenched the door open, and strode out into the freezing, moonless night, leaving her alone in the sudden, echoing silence, the taste of him still on her lips, and his impossible, heartbreaking words hanging in the air like a curse. The cold that Silas left behind was far worse than the chill of the storm. It was a deep, internal freeze of humiliation and rejection. "I'm not allowed to touch you?" The words were a brand, searing into her mind. It wasn't a gentle refusal. It was a verdict, a statement of profound, unbreakable law. He did not *1 her. He was forbidden from wanting her. The distinction was a cruel one. She was not a woman to him, but a temptation to be resisted, a sin he was struggling to avoid. She stumbled back to her cold bed. The warmth from the mead and the fire, a distant memory. The taste of his kiss was still on her lips, a ghost of a passion so real it made the subsequent emptiness unbearable. She lay awake for hours, listening to the silence, waiting for the sound of his return. But he did not come back inside. The faint light of dawn was beginning to outline the window frame when she finally heard the soft creak of the door. She heard him move to the hearth, stoke the fire, his movements weary. He had spent the night outside, in the bitter cold, to escape being in the same room as her. The pain of it was a physical blow. In the days that followed, the wall between them was rebuilt, higher and colder than ever before. He was ruthlessly polite, his silence now laced with an impenetrable formality. He avoided her eyes, passed her things without their fingers touching, and took his meals quickly before retreating once more into the woods. The fragile bridge they had built had been utterly destroyed. Evelyn was left adrift in a sea of confusion and hurt. Her heart, which had just begun to thaw, was now encased in ice. The compassion she had felt for him curdled into a resentful, desperate anger. It was an anger born of powerlessness. She was trapped in this cabin with a man who had ignited a fire in her and then doused it with glacial contempt, and she didn't know why. Was it guilt over Lillian? Was he so devoted to a ghost that he could not touch a living woman? Or was there a darker reason, a truth hidden in the shadows of this mountain? This burning need for answers became an obsession. One afternoon, when he was gone on one of his long, silent journeys into the forest, she gave into it, her hands trembling. She went to the old wooden wardrobe where Lillian's things had fallen. The small, leather-bound book of poetry was still there. She picked it up, her heart pounding. It wasn't poetry. Tucked inside the cover, the book's title, Leaves of Grass, seemed a bitter irony. It was a journal, Lillian's journal. Her hands shook as she opened it. The handwriting was a graceful, looping script, the same as on the handkerchief. But as the pages turned, the letters grew more erratic, slanted and sharp, as if written under great duress. The early entries were filled with hope, descriptions of the majestic mountains and her love for her strong, silent husband. But then, the tone began to shift. Asterisk, October 12th, 1880. Asterisk, asterisk. The silence is a living thing. Silas is a part of it. He walks into the woods and takes all the sound with him. When he returns, his eyes are full of a darkness I do not recognize. Sometimes, I feel as if the mountains are watching me, and he is their keeper. Asterisk, November 3rd, 1880. Asterisk, asterisk. He has a temper that frightens me. Today, a horse kicked over a bucket. The fury that came over his face was terrible to behold. He did not strike the animal, but he struck the fence post beside it, and the wood splintered. He never raises his voice to me, but I see the violence in him, coiled like a snake. I wonder if he is always fighting it back. Asterisk, November 28th, 1880. Asterisk, asterisk. I am so alone. The snow has come, and I feel I shall never see another living soul besides him. He watches me. I feel his eyes on me even when his back is turned. He asks why I no longer hum my tunes. How can I tell him this place has stolen them? He says he loves me, but his love feels like a cage. Evelyn's blood ran cold. This was not the man she had begun to see. Or was it? Was his quietness not sorrow, but a carefully controlled rage? Was his care for her after her fall merely an aberration? The journal painted a portrait of a man on the edge, a brooding, possessive jailer, and it painted a portrait of a woman descending into terror and paranoia. Asterisk, December 15th, 1880. Asterisk, asterisk. He was gone for 2 days. He returned with blood on his coat, from a deer. He said, but his eyes, they held a wildness that terrified me. I asked him where he went. He said only, to a place you must never go. I fear him. God help me, I fear my own husband. I must leave this place before the winter buries me for good. That was the last entry. Evelyn slammed the journal shut, her heart hammering against her ribs. She felt sick. The ambiguity was a torment. Was this the diary of a woman being driven mad by isolation, her perceptions twisted by fear? Or was it a clear-eyed account of living with a dangerous man? She looked around the quiet cabin, which now seemed menacing, every shadow a potential hiding place for a terrible secret. A sharp, sudden rap on the main door made her cry out, dropping the journal. It skittered across the floor. Silas never knocked. Her mind raced. Who could possibly be out here, in the middle of nowhere, with the snow still thick on the ground? Cautiously, she moved to the door, her hand on the heavy iron latch. "Who is it?" she called out, her voice thin. "Mail and supply delivery," a cheerful voice called back. "From Solitude. Got a long overdue parcel for a Mr. Harrow." Relief, sharp and immediate, washed over her. It was just a delivery man. She fumbled with the latch and pulled the heavy door open. The man standing on her doorstep was not a grizzled frontiersman. He was dressed in a fine, albeit snow-dusted, city coat. He was handsome in a clean-shaven, manicured way, with slick dark hair and a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. A cold knot of dread formed in Evelyn's stomach. She knew that smile. "Alistair?" she breathed, the name like ash in her mouth. It was Alistair Finch, the son of one of her father's investors, a persistent, unwelcome suitor she had endured for months in New York, a man whose polite advances always felt like possessive claims. "Evelyn, my dear," he said, his smile widening. He pushed his way past her into the cabin, looking around with an expression of theatrical disgust. "My God, this is where you ran to? This hovel? I must say, I'm disappointed. I always pictured you with more taste." "What are you doing here? How did you find me?" she demanded, her shock giving way to anger. "Oh, it wasn't so difficult," he said, casually brushing snow from his sleeve. "A few inquiries, a few well-placed coins. Your father is beside himself with worry. You know, he sent me to bring you home." "This is my home," she said, the words sounding hollow even to her own ears. Alistair laughed, a short, unpleasant sound. "Don't be ridiculous. This is a prison, and from what I hear in that charming little town, your jailer is a suspected murderer. You've really made a mess of things, haven't you?" He took a step closer, his cologne a sickeningly sweet intrusion in the rustic air. "But I'm here to fix it. We'll go back to New York. You'll apologize to your father, marry Mr. Abernathy as planned, and we'll all forget this little rustic adventure ever happened." "No," Evelyn said, standing her ground. "I'm not going back." Alistair's smile vanished. His face hardened, and she saw the cold, calculating man beneath the polished veneer. "I think you will," he said softly. "You see, I've been talking to the good people of Solitude. They have quite a few stories about your Mr. Harrow. It wouldn't take much, just a little push, a few well-chosen words from a concerned gentleman from the city, to turn their suspicion into a full-blown investigation. Perhaps they'd come up here for another, more thorough search. Who knows what they might find? A misplaced locket? A new, unexplained patch of turned earth come the spring? You're his wife now. They'll think you're an accomplice." The threat was clear. A blade pressed to her throat. He would destroy Silas. He would use the town's poison against him and drag her down with him. "You have 2 weeks," Alistair said, pulling on his gloves. "The snow is starting to melt. I'll be back. If you're not packed and ready to leave with me, I will burn this new life of yours to the ground, and I'll enjoy every minute of it." He opened the door, then paused and gave her one last, chilling smile. "It's your choice, Evelyn. A life of comfort in New York, or a life of ruin here with him. He left, and Evelyn sank into a chair, her body trembling with a fear more profound than any she had felt before. She was trapped, utterly and completely trapped between a man she feared and a man she was beginning to desire, with a predator waiting to destroy them both. She hid the journal and said nothing to Silas when he returned that evening. She couldn't. How could she tell him that her past had followed her here, that she had brought this danger to his door? How could she add this burden to his already heavy load? And a dark, selfish part of her was afraid that if he knew the choice she faced, he might tell her to go, to save herself. The thought was unbearable. So she held the secret inside, a toxic, festering thing. She became jumpy and anxious, her eyes constantly straying to the tree line, expecting to see Alistair's slick smile appear between the pines. She avoided Silas, flinching when he came near, unable to bear his presence because it reminded her of the terrible choice she had to make. He watched her erratic behavior with a quiet, worried expression, the chasm between them growing wider with every passing day. The stress, the fear, and the unrelenting cold finally took their toll. It started with a shiver she couldn't shake, an ache in her bones that deepened into a throbbing pain. By nightfall, she was burning with fever. The cabin began to spin, the shadows on the walls twisting into menacing shapes. She collapsed onto her bed, her body racked with alternating waves of heat and cold. Through the fog of her delirium, she was aware of Silas. He was a constant, steady presence. He bathed her forehead with cool water, the touch of his rough hand surprisingly gentle. He brewed a bitter tea from herbs, holding her head up and patiently coaxing her to drink. He sat in a chair by her bed through the long, dark night, a silent guardian against the fever dreams that plagued her. In her fevered state, the walls she had built around her heart crumbled. She was no longer in Wyoming. She was back in the lonely parlor in New York, then lost in the rattling stagecoach, a ghost in her own life. She murmured names, places, fragments of her past, and then her delirium fixed on the steady presence beside her. "Silas," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. "Don't leave me alone." She reached out a trembling hand, and he took it, his large, calloused hand enveloping hers. The contact was an anchor in the swirling chaos of her mind. "I'm here," his low voice rumbled beside her. "I'm not going anywhere." "It's so cold," she whimpered, lost in a memory of the journey. "So lonely. I just wanted to be wanted." The words came out, the simple, desperate truth of her heart. A tear slid from the corner of her eye and traced a hot path down her temple. He said nothing, but his grip on her hand tightened, a silent, powerful reassurance that he had heard her. He sat with her all night, his presence a warm, solid shield, until finally, as the first gray light of dawn filtered through the window, the fever broke, and she fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. When she finally awoke, the afternoon sun was streaming into the room. Her mind was clear, her body weak but no longer aching. The first thing she saw was Silas. He was slumped in the chair beside her bed, fast asleep, his head resting uncomfortably against the wooden back. His face was etched with exhaustion, and his hand was still holding hers, his fingers loosely curled around her own even in sleep. Her heart, which had been a frozen, terrified knot in her chest, seemed to melt. All the fear, all the suspicion from the journal, all the pain of his rejection, simply dissolved in the face of this undeniable truth. This man, with all his darkness and all his secrets, had stayed. He had cared for her. He had held her hand through the night, and as she lay there, watching the gentle rise and fall of his chest, a new feeling, clearer and more powerful than fear or desire, bloomed within her. It was a fragile, terrifying, and unmistakable tenderness. Her recovery was a slow, gentle sunrise. The weakness in her limbs was a reminder of how close she had come to succumbing, but the oppressive weight on her soul had lifted. In its place was a quiet, watchful tenderness. The fever had burned away the last of her fear, leaving behind the raw, undeniable truth of his care for her. Silas, too, was changed. He no longer fled to the woods at the first opportunity. He stayed near the cabin, mending harnesses, sharpening his axe, his presence a constant, reassuring hum. He still spoke little, but his silence was no longer a void. It was a shared space, comfortable and calm. He would watch her as she regained her strength, his gray eyes holding a new softness, a protective quality that made her heart ache. One afternoon, as she sat by the fire, strong enough now to mend one of his torn shirts, she found the courage to ask a question that had been lingering in her mind. "You mentioned your father," she said, her voice soft. "When you spoke of the mead, was he the one who taught you about the herbs?" Silas was oiling his rifle, his large hands moving with methodical grace. He paused, his hands stilling on the dark, polished wood. He stared down at the rifle for a long moment before answering, and when he did, his voice was low and flat. "He taught me," he said, "and he taught me other things." He set the rifle aside and looked into the fire. He was a hard man. The world had been hard on him, and he passed that hardness on, the only way he knew how. Like a debt, my mother. She was a gentle soul, too gentle for him, too gentle for this land. He broke her spirit, little by little. I watched him do it. The confession hung in the air, plain and terrible. Evelyn stopped her sewing, her needle poised in mid-air. She was seeing him now not as a man, but as the boy he had been, watching a tragedy he was powerless to stop. "He had a rage in him," Silas continued, his voice barely a whisper. "A storm. I have it in me, too. I've spent my whole life fighting it, trying to wall it up. I was so afraid I would become him, that my silence was better than his fists, that my distance would keep people safe from me." Suddenly, Lillian's journal made a new, terrible kind of sense. The splintered fence post, the coiled violence she had sensed in him. It wasn't a monster she had been describing, but a man terrified of the monster inside himself. And his words after he had kissed Evelyn, "I'm not allowed to touch you," were not a rejection of her, but a rejection of himself. He feared that to touch her, to love her, would be to unleash the legacy of his father's rage upon her, just as it had been unleashed on his mother. "That's why you left me that night," Evelyn whispered, understanding dawning like a painful light. "After you kissed me, you weren't pushing me away. You were trying to protect me from yourself." He finally looked at her, and the raw vulnerability in his eyes was a testament to the truth of her words. He gave a single, ragged nod. The confession demanded one in return, the secret of her own past, which had once seemed a world away, now felt like a necessary bridge between them. "I ran away, too, Silas," she said, her voice gaining strength. "Not from a man like your father, but from a different kind of cage." She told him everything, about her cold, ambitious father who saw her as a chess piece in his business dealings, about Mr. Abernathy, the odious man she was meant to marry. She described a world of gilded cages and polite cruelties, where a woman's worth was measured by her dowry and her obedience. "My father looked at me and saw a contract, an alliance," she said, the old bitterness rising in her throat. "I was a commodity, an item to be sold to the highest bidder. That's why I answered your letter. It was honest. You said you needed a wife. My father said he needed a merger. Your honesty felt more like a kindness than his love ever did." He listened, his expression intent, his gray eyes never leaving her face. When she finished, a long silence settled over them. He rose from his chair, crossed the small room, and knelt before her. He took the sewing from her lap, setting it aside, and then took her hands in his. They were rough and calloused against her own, but his touch was incredibly gentle. "No one," he said, his voice a low, fierce vow, "will ever treat you like that again." In that moment, they were no longer just a rancher and his mail-order bride. They were two survivors, two refugees from different worlds who had found an unlikely sanctuary in each other. As the days grew longer, the great thaw began. The world, which had been a study in black and white, slowly began to reveal its colors. The snow receded, exposing the rich, dark earth. The sound of dripping water was a constant, gentle music, a promise of spring. The storm that had brought them together had also damaged the small, dilapidated shed where Silas kept his few animals. Rebuilding it became their next project, a symbol of their own reconstruction. They worked side by side from sunup to sundown. He taught her how to measure and saw the fresh pine logs, the clean, sharp scent of the wood filling the air. She, in turn, learned the rhythm of his work, anticipating which tool he would need. Her presence a quiet, steady support. The physical labor was healing. It was simple, honest work that left them tired and sore, but with a deep sense of satisfaction, and in the easy rhythm of their shared task. The last of the walls between them crumbled. There were easy smiles, shared glances, the accidental brush of hands that now lingered for a half-second too long. The air between them was thick with a new, unspoken language of desire, a simmering heat that had nothing to do with the strengthening sun. One evening, they were finishing the last wall of the new shed. The sun was setting, casting long, golden shafts of light through the gaps in the newly placed boards, striping the hay-strewn floor. A cool breeze whispered through the pines, carrying the scent of damp earth and new life. They stopped, their work done for the day, and stood in the half-finished structure, a monument to their shared effort. Evelyn leaned against a support beam, pushing a stray strand of hair from her face, her body humming with a pleasant weariness. Silas stood a few feet away, his axe in his hand, his silhouette dark against the fiery sunset. He was watching her, his gaze intense, possessive, a look that made the air in her lungs catch. The unspoken thing that had been building between them for days finally reached its breaking point. He took a step toward her, then another. He didn't stop until he was standing directly in front of her. So close she had to tilt her head back to look up at him. He raised a hand, his fingers rough and calloused, and gently tucked the loose strand of hair behind her ear. His touch was electric, a spark that ignited the tinder of their long-suppressed wanting. "Evelyn," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion she had never heard from him before. And that was all it took. The space between them vanished. He pulled her to him, his mouth finding hers in a kiss that was nothing like the first. There was no hesitation now, no fear. There was only a raw, desperate, all-consuming need. It was a kiss of blistering intensity, a release of weeks of tension, of loneliness, of fear and hope, and a desire so profound it was almost painful. Her arms went around his neck, pulling him down to her, and his hands tangled in her hair, holding her fast. It was a frantic, hungry claiming, a mutual surrender. The kiss broke, and they were breathing hard, their foreheads pressed together, their eyes locked in the dying light. There were no words. There was no need for them. With a groan that was part desperation, part reverence, he lifted her into his arms and carried her to a pile of clean, sweet-smelling hay in the corner of the shed. He laid her down gently, the fading sunlight painting stripes of gold across her skin as he began to unlace her dress. What happened next was not gentle or slow. It was a storm, as fierce and untamed as the blizzard that had first thrown them together. It was a raw, elemental collision of two people starved for touch, for connection, for the simple, profound affirmation of another's warmth. It was the roughness of hay against her back, the scent of fresh pine and clean sweat, the hard muscle of his body pressed against the softness of hers. It was urgent and clumsy, fierce and exquisitely tender. It was a desperate, grasping, frantic act of love, a reclaiming of life in the heart of the wilderness. It was the sealing of a pact made in silence and solidified in shared labor, a confirmation that they were no longer two separate souls, but one, Afterward, as the last light bled from the sky, leaving them in the cool, purple twilight of the shed, they lay tangled in each other's arms, their breathing slowly returning to normal. He didn't let her go. He held her pressed against his side, his arm a heavy, protective weight across her stomach, as if he feared she might vanish like the ghost of his past. He stroked her hair, his rough fingers surprisingly gentle. He had been silent throughout, his passion speaking a language more powerful than words. But now, he cleared his throat, and his voice, when he spoke, was a low, humbled rumble against her ear. "My wife," he said. The two words were everything. It wasn't a statement of legal fact. It was a prayer, a vow, a final, absolute acceptance. He wasn't just Silas Harrow, the widower. And she wasn't just Evelyn Hayes, the mail-order bride. In that moment, in the quiet of their new beginning, she was his wife. The tears she had held back for so long finally came, silent and hot, soaking into the rough wool of his shirt. They were tears of relief, of a joy so profound it was painful, of a sense of homecoming she had never known. But beneath the joy was a cold, sharp sliver of fear. The secret she carried, the threat of Alistair's return, was a poison in this perfect moment. The snow was almost gone. The path to solitude would soon be clear. The world they had been hiding from was about to come rushing back. She wanted to tell him everything, to purge the secret and be truly free with him. But the trust between them felt so new, so fragile. What if telling him the truth shattered it? What if he saw her not as his wife, but as the source of a new danger, a harbinger of the world that had already hurt him so badly? She clung to him, burying her face in his chest, her heart torn between the ecstasy of the present and the terrifying uncertainty of the future. The peace lasted less than a week. It was a fragile, precious thing, a bubble of warmth and light in a world that had always been cold and dark. They lived within it, learning the contours of each other's bodies, the rhythms of each other's breath. For the first time, the cabin felt like a home, not a shelter. The silence was filled not with ghosts, but with a deep, abiding contentment. The world intruded on a Tuesday morning. The air was crisp and clear, the sun bright on the patches of melting snow. Evelyn was outside, hanging their washed linens on a line Silas had strung between two pines, when she heard it, the distant, rhythmic beat of shod horses, too many for a single rider. A knot of ice formed in her stomach. She stood still, the damp sheet clutched in her hand, and listened. The sound grew louder, closer. Silas emerged from the new shed, a hammer in his hand, his face already a hard, watchful mask. He had heard it too. His eyes met hers across the small clearing, and in that single glance, the bubble of their peace burst. They came out of the trees like a judgment, 5 riders. At the front, resplendent in a clean, dark wool coat that seemed an offense to the wilderness, was Alistair Finch. His smile was a smug, triumphant slash in his handsome face. Beside him rode a man with a portly belly and a harder, colder expression, clearly a man of law. Behind them were 3 deputies, their faces impassive, their hands resting near the Colts holstered at their hips. They reined in their horses a few yards from the cabin, the animals snorting and stamping in the cool air. The silence of the mountain rushed in, thick with menace. "Good morning, Evelyn," Alistair called out, his voice dripping with condescension. "I told you I'd be back. I see you haven't packed." Silas moved to stand in front of Evelyn, a silent, unmovable wall. His body was tense, but his voice, when he spoke, was a low, dangerous rumble. "You're not welcome here. State your business and leave my property." "Your property?" Alistair laughed. He dismounted, his polished boots sinking into the mud. "I'm not sure how much longer you'll be able to make that claim." He turned to the portly man. "Sheriff, this is the man, Silas Harrow." The sheriff, A man named Brody, according to the badge on his coat, swung a heavy leg over his saddle and landed with a thud. He didn't look at Silas. He looked at Evelyn, his eyes holding a flicker of something that might have been pity. "Silas Harrow," the sheriff said, his voice a gravelly official tone. "I have a warrant to search this property in connection with the disappearance and suspected murder of your first wife, Lillian Harrow." Silas didn't flinch. "That was 5 years ago. You searched then. You found nothing." "New evidence has come to light," Alistair interjected smoothly. Stepping forward, he held up 2 objects for them to see. The first was the delicate linen handkerchief with the name Asterisk, Lillian Asterisk, embroidered in the corner. The second was the small, leather-bound journal. Evelyn's blood ran cold. "A concerned citizen, that would be me," Alistair said with a small, theatrical bow, "funded a more thorough investigation. We found these items carefully hidden away. This journal," he said, tapping the cover, "is filled with Mrs. Harrow's accounts of your temper, your violent episodes, her growing fear for her very life. It ends with her stating her intention to flee from you." He then held up the handkerchief. "And this was found near a deep, overgrown ravine about a mile from here, snagged on a thorn bush, as if it fell during a struggle." "That's a lie," Evelyn said, her voice shaking. "Those things were in the cabin. I found them." Alistair's eyes gleamed with cruel victory. He turned to the sheriff. "Did you hear that? She admits to finding them." A convenient discovery, wouldn't you say? Almost as if she were tasked with planting them. He looked back at Evelyn, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that carried clearly in the still air. Or perhaps she found them, and in her terror of her new husband. She's been hiding them. Notice the fresh fingerprints all over the cover. Sheriff, not just old ones, new ones. The trap snapped shut. Her own touch, her own desperate search for answers, had become the tool of their destruction. She had armed their enemy against them. "That's enough," Silas said, his voice dangerously quiet. "She has nothing to do with this." "On the contrary," Alistair said, "she has everything to do with this. She is the key that unlocked the truth." The sheriff sighed, a weary sound. He finally looked at Silas. "I'm sorry, Harrow, but I have to take you in. The circuit judge will be in solitude in 2 days. You can tell your story to him." He nodded to his deputies, who dismounted and began to approach Silas, their hands now firmly on their pistols. Evelyn looked at Silas. She expected to see the coiled rage he had spoken of, the fury of his father. But it wasn't there. His face was a mask of utter, soul-crushing despair. The fight had gone out of him. It was the face of a man who had been expecting this sentence his entire life, the face of a man who believed, on some fundamental level, that he deserved it. He looked at her, and his eyes were filled with a terrible, silent apology. "I've brought this darkness on you," his gaze said. "Asterisk, I have ruined you." He didn't resist as the deputies flanked him. He simply stood there, a statue of defeat, as they bound his hands in front of him with a rough rope. "No!" Evelyn cried, lunging forward. "You can't! He's innocent!" One of the deputies put a firm hand on her shoulder, holding her back. Alistair watched, his expression one of pure, malicious satisfaction. This was his victory. He had not won her back, but he had successfully burned her new world to the ground. They led Silas to a spare horse, and he mounted with a heavy, weary grace. As they prepared to leave, he turned his head and looked at her one last time. His face was unreadable, but his eyes held a universe of pain. Then he turned away, a prisoner once more to the ghosts of his past, this time in iron and rope. Evelyn stood frozen, watching them ride away until they were swallowed by the trees, the sound of their horses fading into the awful silence. The linen she had been hanging flapped forlornly on the line, a white flag of surrender. She was alone. The secret she had kept, the threat she had hidden, had come to pass. Her silence had cost him his freedom. A terrible, wrenching sob tore through her, a sound of guilt and fury. She sank to her knees in the mud, the cold seeping into her dress, and wept. But as the minutes stretched on, the grief began to cool, hardening into something else, a cold, sharp resolve. She would not let this happen. She would not let Alistair win. She was no longer the frightened girl who had fled New York. She was Silas Harrow's wife, and he had not abandoned her to the fever. She would not abandon him to this. She stood up, her face streaked with tears and mud. Her course was clear. The town of Solitude had condemned him with whispers. She would go there and force it to yield the truth. Wasting no time, she went into the cabin. Her home, now just a cold, empty shell. She changed into her most durable dress and boots, packed a small satchel with the last of their bread and a skin of water, and took the few silver coins she had hidden in her trunk. Then she went to the shed, her hands steady as she saddled the calmer of the 2 horses. The animal snorted, sensing her urgency. Within the hour, she was riding down the mountain, her back to the empty cabin, her face set toward the town that hated her husband. The journey was a blur of grim determination. She rode hard, pushing the horse, her mind racing. She went over Lillian's journal in her head, searching for a clue, a name, anything she might have missed. The journal spoke of loneliness and fear, but it was the last entry that echoed in her mind. Asterisk, I must leave this place. Lillian hadn't just been afraid. She had been making a plan, and one did not make such a plan in a vacuum. She must have had help. She must have had a destination. She must have had someone waiting for her. She reached Solitude as the sun was beginning to set. The town was buzzing with the news. Men stood in knots outside the saloon, their voices low and excited. As she rode down the muddy main street, all eyes turned to her. The whispers followed her, now emboldened, triumphant. That's her, the new one. Come to see the show, has she? She ignored them, dismounting in front of the general store. She tied her horse to the rail and walked inside, the proprietor and the 2 women from her first day. Martha and her friend were there, their conversation stopping the moment she entered. Evelyn walked directly to them, her exhaustion and fear burned away by the white-hot intensity of her purpose. I need to speak with you, she said, her voice clear and steady, leaving no room for argument. She looked at Martha. You told me about Lillian. You spoke of her as if you knew her. Martha, a woman who thrived on gossip but wilted under direct confrontation, shifted uncomfortably. We all knew her, in a manner of speaking. Did you know her as a friend? Evelyn pressed, taking a step closer. Did she ever speak to you? Confide in you? Lillian kept to herself mostly. The other woman, Sarah, offered. Especially that last year. She was changed. How was she changed? Evelyn asked. She seemed distracted, Martha said, finally meeting Evelyn's gaze. Excited, almost furtive, like she was keeping a happy secret. It was right before that big storm hit. She came into town for supplies, bought a new ribbon for her hair. Seemed strange, buying fripperies for a winter on the mountain. But she was humming. First time I'd heard her hum in years. A new ribbon, a happy secret. It didn't fit the narrative of a terrified woman. Did she speak of anyone? Evelyn asked, her heart beginning to beat faster. A man? Someone in town? The 2 women exchanged a nervous glance. It's just gossip, Sarah mumbled, looking at the floor. This is my husband's life we're talking about. Evelyn's voice rose, sharp and commanding. What gossip? It was Martha who finally cracked. She leaned forward, her voice a conspiratorial whisper. There was a man, a peddler, name of Jacob Reed. He passed through every few months. Handsome fella, smooth talker. He paid Lillian a good deal of attention, made no secret of it. Folks saw them talking down by the creek more than once. Silas was up on the mountain, none the wiser. "Where is he now?" Evelyn demanded. "He has a small homestead," Martha said. "A few miles south of here. Leased it a few years back, said he was tired of the road, but he's a coward. That one. After Lillian disappeared and folks started talking about Silas, Jacob made himself scarce. He never came courting any other girls after that. A coward. Hiding. It was the missing piece. Lillian wasn't running asterisk from asterisk Silas's rage. She was running asterisk to asterisk a new life with another man. Evelyn didn't wait to hear more. She turned and strode from the store, leaving the women gaping in her wake. She mounted her horse and kicked it into a gallop, heading south as the last light faded from the sky. She found the homestead an hour later, a small, dark shack set back from the road, a thin curl of smoke rising from its chimney. She dismounted, her heart pounding, and banged her fist on the rough wooden door. After a long moment, the door creaked open, and a man stood there, silhouetted by the lantern light from within. He was handsome in a weak sort of way, with a neatly trimmed beard and shifty eyes. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice nervous. "Are you Jacob Reed?" she asked. He nodded cautiously. "My name is Evelyn Harrow. You were planning to leave with Lillian Harrow 5 years ago, weren't you?" The blood drained from the man's face. He tried to slam the door, but Evelyn was faster, shoving her boot into the opening. "You are going to tell me what happened?" she said, her voice low and trembling with a cold fury. "You are going to write it all down. You let an innocent man rot under suspicion for 5 years to save your own skin. That ends tonight." She pushed her way inside. For the next hour, she confronted him, using the details from the journal, the whispers from the town, and the pure, righteous force of her will. He crumpled under the assault, his bravado dissolving into pathetic, blubbering pleas. He confessed it all. They had planned to run away together to California. He was waiting for her at the edge of town when the blizzard hit, but she never came. He was too afraid of the storm, and too afraid of Silas, to go looking for her. When her disappearance became a murder accusation, he stayed quiet, letting the shadow of guilt fall on another man. With shaking hands, he took the quill and paper she provided and wrote out his confession, his statement of the truth. He described their plans, her excitement, his own cowardice. As he signed his name, a sudden gust of wind rattled the small window. Evelyn looked outside. The stars were gone. A thick, heavy darkness had fallen, and drifting down from that darkness were the first fat flakes of snow. She snatched the paper from his hand without another word, ran from the shack, and mounted her horse. The storm was returning. The circuit judge was coming in 2 days, but a heavy snow could close the roads, trapping her here and sealing Silas's fate. She spurred her horse on, racing back toward solitude, the precious confession tucked safely inside her coat. The wind began to howl, and the snow started to drive down, cold and relentless, as she galloped into the teeth of the rising storm. Her journey wasn't over. The most perilous part had just begun. The ride back to solitude was a waking nightmare. The storm, which had been a mere threat, unleashed its full fury, a swirling vortex of wind and blinding snow. Evelyn bent low over the horse's neck, the animal's labored breaths pluming in the frigid air. The world was reduced to a churning chaos of white, the path visible only a few feet ahead. The wind shrieked, tearing at her clothes, trying to rip Jacob Reed's precious confession from the safety of her coat. Every muscle in her body screamed in protest, but she pushed on, driven by a single, desperate image, Silas's face, not angry but broken, as they led him away. She reached the town just as the last of the day's light was strangled by the storm. Solitude was hunkered down, its windows glowing yellow against the blizzard, looking less like a town and more like a handful of embers fighting not to be extinguished. She half fell from the saddle, her horse trembling with exhaustion, and stumbled toward the light and noise spilling from the saloon. This was where the circuit judge, a man named Patterson, was holding his impromptu court. Pushing through the heavy doors, she was hit by a wall of heat, smoke, and the smell of wet wool and whiskey. The entire town seemed to be crammed inside. Farmers, trappers, merchants, and their wives stood shoulder to shoulder, their faces a mixture of morbid curiosity and grim certainty. At the front of the room, a makeshift bar serving as a bench, sat a gray-bearded man with weary eyes, Judge Patterson. To one side stood Alistair Finch, looking smug and composed, and there, seated on a crate between two deputies, was Silas. He looked up as she entered, a gust of snow swirling in behind her. The flicker of surprise in his eyes was quickly extinguished, replaced by a deep, despairing sorrow. He thought she had come to watch him be condemned. "Well, well," Alistair said loudly, drawing all attention to her. "Look what the storm blew in. Come to offer a character witness for your murdering husband, my dear." A few men chuckled darkly. Evelyn ignored them. She pushed her way through the silent, parting crowd, her wet cloak leaving a trail on the dusty floorboards. She walked directly to the judge, her gaze unwavering. "Judge Patterson," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "My husband is an innocent man. You are condemning him based on the lies of this man." She pointed a trembling finger at Alistair. "And on a 5-year-old tragedy that this town has twisted into a ghost story." The judge looked down at her, his expression unreadable. "Ma'am, I have a signed journal from the deceased, detailing her fear of her husband, and a handkerchief found near a place where a body could easily be disposed of. What do you have?" "I have the truth," she said. She reached inside her coat, her fingers numb, and pulled out the folded, slightly damp piece of paper. "I have a signed confession from the man Lillian Harrow was running away to meet." A collective gasp went through the room. The silence was absolute, broken only by the crackle of the pot-belly stove. She handed the paper to the judge. Alistair's confident smirk faltered for the first time. Judge Patterson unfolded the paper and began to read, his brow furrowed in concentration. As he read, the whispers started, a low, rustling sound that grew into a murmur of disbelief and confusion. Silas stared at her, his mouth slightly agape, a dawning, incredulous hope in his eyes. "This is preposterous," Alistair blustered, stepping forward. "This is a fabrication. Who is this Jacob Reed? A local coward. I'd wager—" She's obviously coerced him, threatened him into writing this fantasy. "He wrote it because his conscience could no longer bear the weight of his cowardice," Evelyn retorted, her voice ringing with a conviction that silenced the room. "He let you all believe a lie because he was too afraid to admit the truth, that he promised a woman a new life and then abandoned her to a storm." "It proves nothing," Alistair insisted, his face flushed. "It's the word of one coward against a diary full of a terrified woman's pleas." The town was divided. She could see it in their faces. Some looked at the confession in the judge's hand, their certainty wavering. Others looked at Alistair, a man of wealth and status from the city, and chose to believe his confident denials. The poison of suspicion, once rooted, was not easily drawn out. Evelyn knew the letter was not enough. She had to give them more. She had to give them herself. She turned from the judge to face the townspeople, her audience, her jury. "You don't know me," she began, her voice gaining strength. "You see me as another foolish woman from the East, a mail-order bride who didn't know what she was getting into. And in a way, you are right, I didn't, but you don't know why I came here." She took a deep breath. "I came here because I, too, was running away. I was running from a life where I was nothing more than a piece of property. My father had arranged for me to marry a man I despised, a man of business and wealth, not unlike Mr. Finch here, a man who saw me not as a wife, but as an asset. I was to be traded for a better future, for his future, not mine. I was trapped." She looked directly at Silas now, her heart in her eyes. "And then I received a letter. It was a simple, honest letter from a man who said he needed a wife. He offered me a hard life, but an honest one. And I chose that. I chose the honesty of this mountain over the gilded cage I was born into. I chose this man. Her voice dropped, becoming intimate, pleading. You see him as a monster, a silent, brooding figure who haunts your town's memory. You've let 5 years of suspicion fester into a certainty, but I have lived in his home. I have seen the man you refused to see. During the last blizzard, when the storm tore a hole in our cabin, he fought to protect me. When I was sick with a fever that nearly took my life, he sat by my side all night and never left. He held my hand and kept me tethered to this world. She turned back to the crowd, her eyes scanning their faces, begging for understanding. I ask you to look at him, not at the ghost you've created, but at the man. Look at his eyes. Is that the gaze of a murderer? Or is it the gaze of a man who has been carrying a grief so heavy it has ground him into silence? A man who lost a wife he loved to the same wilderness that he protects his new wife from. A profound silence descended upon the saloon. No one moved. No one spoke. They were looking at Silas, truly looking at him, perhaps for the first time in 5 years. And in the flickering lamplight, they saw not a monster, but a man worn down by sorrow and solitude, his face a roadmap of a hard, lonely life. Judge Patterson cleared his throat. He looked down at the confession, then at Lillian's journal, then at Alistair, whose face was now pale with fury. There is no body, the judge said, his voice carrying the weight of finality. There is no weapon. There is only a diary from a woman who was, by all accounts, including her own, unhappy and planning to leave. And now there is a signed statement from the man she was planning to leave with. Suspicion is not proof. It is a cloud that can blind good people, in the absence of any concrete evidence of a crime. And in light of this new testimony, all charges against Silas Harrow are dismissed. He is a free man. A sigh of relief, of tension released, went through the room. Silas closed his eyes, his shoulders slumping as the weight of 5 years finally lifted. Alistair, his face a mask of cold rage, turned without a word and shoved his way through the crowd and out into the storm, a man defeated. Silas was free, but the victory was a hollow one. As Evelyn moved to his side and the deputies cut the ropes from his wrists, the townspeople did not rush to offer apologies. They shuffled their feet, avoided their eyes, and began to melt away in small, quiet groups. They had been denied their monster, and they were not pleased. The acquittal had freed him from jail, but not from their judgment. His name was cleared, but his reputation was still a ruin. They walked out of the saloon into the dying storm. The snow was lighter now, the wind a low moan. They collected their horses and began the long, silent ride back up the mountain. The world was clean and white, but it felt like a graveyard, a pristine tomb for a life that could have been. They reached the cabin in the early morning hours. The fire was dead. The air inside was stale and cold. This place, which had so recently become a home, a sanctuary of shared passion and fragile hope, now felt haunted again. It was a tomb of memories, of Lillian's sad ghost, of their own brief, interrupted peace, of the injustice that had been born here. Without a word, they knew what they had to do. They could not stay. They began to pack, moving through the small cabin in a silent, synchronized dance. Evelyn folded her few dresses into her trunk. Silas gathered his tools, his traps, the few possessions he had. They were leaving everything else behind. The rough-hewn table where they had shared their first silent meals, the chairs where they had huddled together during the storm, the bed where she had recovered from her fever. They were packing away not just their things, but the past itself. When they were finished, 2 small piles of belongings sat by the door. The cabin stood empty and waiting. The sun was rising, casting a pale, watery light through the window. It was time to go. But first, there was one last thing. Silas turned to her. The exhaustion and sorrow were still in his eyes. But underneath, something new was dawning. A deep, quiet gratitude. a love so profound it needed no words. He reached for her, his hands gentle on her waist, and drew her to him. He led her to the center of the empty room, and they made love one last time. On the floor, on the spot where their life together had begun, and now where it was ending. It was not like the first, frantic coupling in the shed. This was slow and deep and exquisitely gentle. It was a farewell to the ghosts, a deliberate, tender act of overriding the pain and sorrow that clung to these walls. It was a final, quiet claiming of each other, a promise that what they had found here, they would take with them. It was a benediction and a goodbye. Afterward, they lay in each other's arms, the cool morning air on their skin. The past was gone. The future was an unknown territory. All they had was this moment. Evelyn propped herself up on one elbow and looked down at him, her hair falling around her face. She traced the line of his scar with her finger, the scar that had once terrified her. She leaned down, her lips close to his ear, and whispered the question that had started it all, the question that had bridged the first chasm between them. "Do you fear me or want me?" This time, there was no hesitation. There was no confusion. Silas answered by turning his head, his mouth capturing hers in a kiss that was deep and sure and unending. It was a kiss that held no fear, only want. A kiss that tasted of goodbye to this place, and of hello to the rest of their lives. They left Wyoming at dawn, two solitary figures riding north with their few possessions loaded onto a pack horse. They didn't look back. The mountain that had been both prison and sanctuary receded behind them, a jagged silhouette against the rising sun. It was a tombstone for a life that was over, and they were riding away from its shadow, toward a blank, unforgiving horizon. The journey was long and arduous, but it was a shared hardship that forged them closer. They spoke little, but their silence was no longer born of uncertainty or fear. It was the comfortable, easy quiet of two people who understood each other on a level deeper than words. They communicated through shared glances, the simple gesture of passing a canteen of water, the way he would lay a blanket over her as she slept by the fire. He was no longer the intimidating stranger, and she was no longer the fragile city bird. They were partners, equals in the great, raw wilderness. They crossed into the Montana territory, a land that felt wilder, grander, and somehow more hopeful than the one they had left behind. The mountains here were vast and majestic, their peaks scraping a sky that seemed impossibly blue. They followed a river, its water clear and rushing, until they found what they were looking for, a small, forgotten valley nestled between two protective ridges, with a meadow of rich green grass and a stand of tall, straight lodgepole pines. It was here they staked their claim. They bought the small parcel of land with the last of Evelyn's money and the few dollars Silas had saved. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. No ghost haunted this valley, no whispers tainted the wind. It was a clean slate. Building their new life was the hardest work either of them had ever known. They started with a simple lean-to, a temporary shelter against the elements. Then, with an axe and a saw, they began to build their home. It was a slow, back-breaking process. Silas, with his immense strength and innate knowledge of the wood, felled the pines and notched the logs. Evelyn, her hands now calloused and strong, helped him peel the bark, mix the mud and moss for chinking, and lift the heavy beams into place. They worked from the first light of dawn until their muscles screamed and the sun dipped below the western ridge. They ate simple meals of smoked fish and sourdough bread, their bodies aching but their spirits content. In the evenings, they would sit by their campfire, watching the stars blaze to life in the vast, dark sky, a canopy of silent, benevolent witnesses to their labor. In these quiet moments, they truly learned each other. He told her stories of his childhood, not of the darkness of his father, but of the brief, bright moments with his mother, the way she taught him the names of the wildflowers, the taste of the wild berries she'd pick, Evelyn, in turn, read to him from one of the books she had carried all the way from New York. Her voice was a soft, melodic counterpoint to the crackle of the fire and the distant call of a lone wolf. He would listen, his head tilted, his expression rapt, a man starved for a beauty he had never known. As the cabin took shape, so did their life together. It was a life of simple, profound intimacy. It was in the way she would bring him a cup of hot coffee in the cool mornings, her hand resting on his shoulder for a moment. It was in the way he would stop his work to watch her, a small, quiet smile touching his lips as she knelt to tend the small vegetable garden she had planted. They were healing each other, filling in the broken pieces of their pasts with a mortar of shared work and unwavering devotion. The scars were still there. His silent moods would sometimes return, and she would occasionally wake from a dream of Alistair's cruel smile. But the wounds were no longer open and raw. They were a part of who they were, a reminder of the journey that had brought them to this valley. One afternoon, a traveling preacher and his wife passed through, their wagon a small, mobile island of civilization. They shared a meal with Evelyn and Silas, and the preacher's wife, a kind, motherly woman, looked at Evelyn with knowing eyes. "It's a hard life for a woman out here," the woman said gently, "especially for those who come from away. So many come with hope in their hearts, only to find loneliness and hardship they couldn't imagine." The conversation sparked an idea in Evelyn. That evening, by the light of a flickering tallow candle, she began to write. She wrote not a journal of fear, but a letter of hope. She wrote her story, not the lurid, gossip-worthy version, but the truth of it. She wrote of her flight from a gilded cage, of her fear of the silent man on the mountain, and of the slow, difficult journey toward understanding and love. She wrote of the trial, of the town's prejudice, and of their decision to start anew. She ended the letter with a simple message. "The West is an unforgiving land, but it is also a place of new beginnings. Do not let loneliness be your master. Hardship can forge a bond that comfort can never know. Hold fast to honesty, and have the courage to see the man, not the myth." She gave the letter to the preacher, asking him to pass it along to any woman he met who might need to hear its message, any mail-order bride who felt lost and alone. It was her way of lighting a candle in the darkness, of turning her own painful experience into a beacon for others. It was her final act of defiance against the world that had tried to break her. Summer faded into a crisp, golden autumn. The cabin was finished, a small, sturdy home that smelled of fresh pine and wood smoke. It was a testament to their shared labor, every log a symbol of their resilience. They were poor, their possessions were few, but they were rich in a way Evelyn had never known in her father's grand house. They had each other. They had their freedom. They had a home they had built with their own hands. It was more than enough. It was everything. The first snow of the season came in late October. It was not the violent, furious blizzard of Wyoming, but a gentle, silent fall of thick, white flakes. Evelyn stood at the single window of their new home, watching the valley slowly disappear under a blanket of pure white. The world was being made clean again. Silas came to stand behind her, his arms wrapping around her waist, his chin resting on her shoulder. They stood there together, watching the snow fall, two figures framed in the warm, golden light of the cabin. The fire crackled in the hearth, the room filled with a comfortable, peaceful warmth. Evelyn felt a gentle flutter deep within her, a secret she had been holding for a few weeks, a quiet, joyful confirmation of their new life taking root. She leaned back against his solid chest, her body soft and pliant against his. She lifted one of her hands and placed it gently over her flat stomach. It was a small, simple gesture, but he understood it instantly. His arms tightened around her, a fierce, protective embrace. He buried his face in her hair, and she felt the tremor that went through his powerful frame. It was not a shudder of sorrow or fear, but of a profound, overwhelming joy. He turned her in his arms to face him. He didn't speak. He simply looked at her, his storm-gray eyes, once so full of shadows and ghosts, now clear and bright, reflecting the firelight and a love so deep it left her breathless. He lowered his head and kissed her. A long, slow kiss, full of promises and gratitude. A kiss that sealed their past and welcomed their future. He pulled back slightly and looked out the window, at the snow-covered peaks that guarded their valley. He was no longer a prisoner of the mountains, but a king in his own small, perfect kingdom. The darkness was gone from his eyes, vanquished by the steady, unwavering light of her love. She looked around their small, warm home, at the flickering candlelight, at the man whose soul she had helped heal, at the future that was now growing inside her, all the fear, the loneliness, the hardship. It had all led to this peace, to this perfect, unassailable want. She reached up and touched his face, her thumb tracing the line of his jaw. He turned his gaze from the mountains back to her, his wife, his home, in the quiet of their cabin, with the snow falling softly outside. Evelyn smiled and whispered the words that were the final, triumphant truth of their story. "This time," she said, her voice full of a quiet, certain joy, "I don't fear, I want... Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Thank you for listening to our story. We'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from, so please leave a comment below and let us know. For more tales from the frontier, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, From Wild West, and share your thoughts on Evelyn and Silas's journey.